This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Even though I majored in history in college, the subject plays a limited role in my work, especially when it comes to Vietnam, which is mostly what I write about. I don't delve into the topic of the newsletter unless it's recent history from the last few years. And even after a decade plus of living here, my knowledge of pre-1945 or even pre-1975 Vietnam is admittedly pretty thin. Now, that's partially my own fault, of course. I'll take some responsibility there. But it's also partially down to a relative lack of books or other material on Vietnamese history, in English, I'll add, accessible to the average reader, especially from a Vietnamese or overseas Vietnamese perspective. This is not to say that there are no English language history books on Vietnam with broad appeal, but the author names on the covers of those books are often decidedly un-Vietnamese. The academic space, though, has plenty of Vietnamese voices, two of whom are on today's show. But let's be honest, academic writing is hardly accessible to many, and I'll include myself there. And school, of course, doesn't really help, certainly not in the United States, where I grew up. Vietnam is simply taught as a war and nothing else, if it's even taught in that aspect. So how can Vietnam's rich, complicated history be opened up to more people? Today's guests are Yen Vu, assistant professor and major coordinator in literature at Fulbright University, Vietnam, and Kevin Pham, assistant professor of political theory at the University of Amsterdam. They also host the excellent Nam Phong Dialogues, which is, in their description, a podcast with the purpose of making history, especially about Vietnam, accessible. We discussed the creation of Nam Phong Dialogues and why they chose to pursue a podcast in addition to their full-time academic work, the inspiration behind the name, the importance of making Vietnamese history accessible, how they choose topics to discuss, and navigating potentially sensitive subject matter, current focal points within global Vietnamese studies, and their thoughts on the Sympathizer TV adaptation that came out earlier this year and its broader significance in centering the Vietnamese experience of the war, and more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Ian and Kevin. Ian and Kevin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Likewise.
Yeah, so it's always cool to have on other people who have their own podcasts, which is, what led me to invite you, although we'll talk about more than just that. But what led to the creation of Nam Phong Dialogues? I mean, I look back, I think it was 2021 when it started. So why that medium? You know, you guys are both in kind of academic spaces. I guess maybe that's not, sometimes you might write a book, or not that you can't do both, but why a podcast?
Thanks for this question. I mean, I'll take a shot at this. So for me, there's really kind of three answers here. One is for fun, the other is sense of duty, and the third is strategy. So for the first one, personal pleasure, fun, fulfillment, I like the idea of learning about Vietnam with someone else from a similar background. By that I mean a Vietnamese American from California who is raised Catholic, but who's open-minded, who's interested in philosophy and wants to get into academia. And I met that person. That was Yen. And we met in 2017, and we would have these conversations. And the idea came up to do a podcast. And that leads me to the second reason, which is a sense of duty. So I feel very lucky. I've had many mentors and opportunities in my life to go into academia. So I felt like I should give back to younger generations. Like a younger me would have loved this. I tried reading a lot of history books, but it's just easier to listen to podcasts. And if I could just share one comment that we received from this person, we don't know who they are, but they wrote to us and they said, stumbled across this podcast after doing some digging on Vietnamese history late one night. I'm 20 and just starting to learn more about our country's culture and history. Thanks for being a voice.
Wow.
Like that just warms my heart, And for me, another duty is to kind of provide a corrective, I think, to popular understandings of Vietnam, especially for many Americans who think that Vietnam is kind of just a war, destruction. But I want to show that Vietnamese people are more than just victims or heroes or villains in this big historical drama of revolution and war. Instead, Vietnamese people can be thinkers. They can be philosophers. They can be creative and intellectual. And lastly, to political theory, I want to show that it's not just European white men who think about how society should be organized. So in our podcast, at least for me, I like to talk about political thought of Vietnamese thinkers. So take a look at our Ideas of Freedom series, our Hybridity and Cosmopolitanism episode, our episodes on the Tonkin Free School. And I'll just end by saying the third thing is strategy. So it helps me to do this podcast to brainstorm ideas for projects and articles for publication, because that's my job. To get tenure, you need publications. And it's also an excuse to read books that I've been wanting to read. And actually, you had mentioned, Mike, that it doesn't help, but it actually does for tenure, because they want to see us sort of as like public intellectuals. So it helps if I say that I have a podcast. What about you, Yan?
I think you hit things on the nail just by organizing a response in that way. But it was really just an organic emergence. So we would have these conversations, and then one of us would be like, what if we had a podcast? But I think ultimately what I wanted out of the podcast also was to model a different kind of intellectual engagement that was beyond just papers or conferences or publications. You can have conversations with somebody and it doesn't end there. And now for my classes, podcasts are also one form of assessment that I allow my students to have. So I just think in general, podcasts allow a different kind of mode of intellectual engagement.
Yeah. And if I could just quickly add, Yen and I had been talking about this idea for a podcast, but it really wasn't until we were both invited to this retreat in Seattle, where Dung Vu, who's a professor at the University of Oregon, he kind of invited all these scholars of Vietnam, a handful of us, to Seattle for a weekend. And when we were there, we kind of pitched this idea, we kind of threw it out, and we got a lot of support for this idea, and also material support. So he helped fund, financially support us with the music for the podcast. But my point was that it took some social uptake from this community of Vietnam scholars. So that's why we did it.
Yeah, I mean, all that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think so. Obviously, I'm not Vietnamese, although I was also raised Catholic, like both of you. But from the history side, I'm in my mid 30s. So, when I was in high school and elementary school, it seemed like history class always kind of ended at the Vietnam War, and it would be very cursory. I mean, I think I remember, so, I moved here with very little actual knowledge of the country. And I don't remember when, but like at some point realized that even stuff like the Tet Offensive, I somehow thought was like an American offensive or something. And just, not even the little history we did learn about the country was not exactly sufficient. And yeah, I mean, I noticed and it's on your website, but that you were thinking of your nieces and nephews and adult Vietnamese friends and how, they would like to learn about Vietnamese history, just if it was more accessible, which is a really cool goal of your podcast. And where did the name, just quickly, what did the name mean, Nam Phong Dialogues?
So when Kevin and I met, we learned that we had a lot of overlapping interests, and we both were writing and researching on one intellectual. His name was Pham Nguyen. And Pham Nguyen in the early 20th century had a journal called Nam Phong Tạp chí, and Nam Phong means southern wind or southern energy, southern spirits. And it was the first journal of its kind to be published in 3 different languages, and to have information on, modern research, vocabulary, literary essays. It was kind of everything under the sun. And we just really liked the impetus behind this journal. And so as a nod to Pham Nguyen, which is our shared research interest, and a nod to this earlier version of intellectual engagement, which was very unprecedented at the time in the early 20th century. So we wanted to kind of think about that and channel that in in the title of our podcast.
Right. And if I could just add, I mean, it was the most influential intellectual journal at the time. And one thing about Pham Nguyen is that he was really big on wanting to harmonize East and West. He sort of essentialized East and West. So that's kind of problematic. But he really believed that they could be married, kind of. So he was introducing the Vietnamese people to ideas from the West, but also telling the Vietnamese people to be proud of their culture, to assert their own culture. And so for me, like, I kind of felt like growing up in the U.S., being Vietnamese American, I could identify with that, growing up in two different cultural worlds. So I identified with Pham Nguyen, and Yen did too, I guess.
So we touched on this a little bit already, and I know some aspects of this question might be a little obvious, but why is it important to make history accessible? And I guess maybe specifically Vietnamese history.
When you had talked about what you had learned in history classrooms about the Vietnam War, I was thinking back to whether I remembered anything I learned. And honestly, I couldn't. And I'm pretty sure if there was something about Vietnam, I would have paid attention, but there was barely anything. And can you imagine, if you're in class and nothing touches upon your history, then you kind of get the feeling that, like, do I even matter? So I think that's really important in terms of redefining what history means and how we understand, or how we even study history. So history, I would say, is kind of the everyday telling or living of a story. And it doesn't even have to be what makes it into a textbook. And what does make it into a textbook is what we might call history with a capital H. And you need to kind of demystify that and give it the idea as being the only official or the only account of history. So if we can normalize history being, okay, me and Kevin just talking about past events change over time, the cause and effect of things and the repercussion of certain events, that could hopefully cause a little ripple in how others will think about history, and also feel less daunted about learning history and learning about the past. People think, oh, okay, I have to learn Vietnamese history by this huge tome of a book, and that's definitely not the case.
Right. And when I was an undergraduate at UC Irvine, I mean, I took a history course called the Vietnam War, and I enjoyed it. But then looking back, I realized that we learned literally nothing about the actual Vietnamese people, like what they thought. We didn't learn anything about what their ideas were. And so when I was 18, trying to learn about the country my parents fled from, I would try to read history books, but I often got bogged down with excessive detail. Do I really need to know this? Like, I was more interested in the ideas, and the meaning, and the stories. I wanted insight into the human condition. And so I think that this podcast hopefully will give, something to people to listen to rather than just to read. And should I make my pitch right now? Because so part of making history accessible actually is so listeners, I have a new book coming out. It's called The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization. Very proud of it.
Very smooth. Very smooth, Kevin.
Not smooth at all, but it's some shameless self-promotion here.
Hey, it's okay. We've got to do it.
Yeah. It's my first book. It's coming out with Oxford University Press on September 24, 2024. And the book looks at 6 key thinkers in Vietnam and how they responded to French colonialism and how they sought to be architects of Vietnamese dignity. So, but basically, when I wrote the book and when I do the podcasts, I have a very specific audience member in mind, and that was my younger self, who didn't really like reading detailed history books, who was more interested in the ideas. So that's who I wrote it to.
Well, that's cool. I think actually I have a couple other episodes recorded. I think this will come out like the day before your book release. So very accidental timing.
Cool.
So you mentioned that audience, the audience of one, I suppose, but for the podcast, I mean, Kevin, you mentioned it's good for brainstorming ideas. How do you choose what topics to talk about? I mean, the episodes are pretty diverse in terms of what you cover. So what's that process like?
Yeah. Yeah. And go ahead.
I would say that, so going back to what Kevin was talking about in terms of strategizing, because we do the podcast on top of our everyday jobs and everyday lives. And so we think about, okay, how do we make this efficient but also productive for us? And oftentimes it's what we're working on currently in our own research. Maybe we need to have a conversation about and work through some of the ideas that we're stuck on. And the idea, though, is not just to double dip. It's also to talk through and model that public engagement that I was just mentioning earlier, that intellectual engagement is very collaborative and very community-oriented. And scholarship that does that is good scholarship. So I think that's also an important thing to model and to show, especially to youth, who is our intended audience. And honestly, a lot of the times it's just a response to our listeners. Our listeners might write to us and say, I really like this topic, or have you read this book? Or I would love to hear what you think about the Sympathizer, these kinds of things. And we appreciate all of that feedback. So please keep them coming.
Right. And I mean, just a few days ago, I was with my mother-in-law, and she's French. And she listens to this podcast, and she tells me she enjoys it. And so over lunch, I asked her, what would you like to hear more of? Do you have any ideas for an episode? And then she was like, well, I really enjoyed the episode on your mothers. And so how about you do an episode on your fathers? And wow, I didn't even think of that. And then I was like, tell me more. What else? And she said, well, I would also like to know more about how your parents adapted to the United States. It's like, how did I not think of this? So it's a conversation with our listeners, as Yen said.
Okay. And that leads perfectly into my next question. Obviously you just named a couple people in your audience, but I guess who's the show for? I know that's a kind of a broad question, or who do you hope is listening to it?
Yeah. So, our target is basically the youth, namely young people in their late teens, early 20s. We know that this is a pretty formative time intellectually, and so we want people to know what's possible as resources. And actually, if we look at our data, our biggest age group is around 28 to 34, and then the second biggest is 23 to 27. And turns out that we have listeners from about 39 countries, according to the analytics, and the top 5 are the US, and then Vietnam, then Canada, then Germany, and then Netherlands. I'm pretty sure I'm responsible for the Netherlands because I think my students listen.
Those students.
Yen is responsible for Vietnam, maybe.
Okay. Well, definitely some countries with big overseas Vietnamese communities.
Yes.
And then, you guys are both in the academic spheres. Regarding Vietnamese studies, kind of more broadly, I guess on a global scale or within your communities you interact with, what are people currently researching and writing about?
Yeah, so well, basically so much. The field has just exploded in the last 20 years with new generations of scholars, such as Yen and I. And but I'll just name one. Like, there's a whole new wave of scholarship on South Vietnam, because previous waves of scholarship, especially during the war, they tended to portray the South Vietnamese as just mere puppets of Americans. But it turns out that the South Vietnamese were more complicated thinkers. So, for example, we recently had 2 edited volumes edited by Dung Vu and Nguyen Trân and Drit Vu, Building a Republican Nation in Vietnam, 1920 to 1963. And then they had another volume come out that covered 1963 to 1975. You have another book by Vang Nguyen Marshall, Between War and the State Civil Society in South Vietnam, 1954, 1975. And then there's another book on communists in the South. So basically, and that book's called Southern Voices, Viet Dong and the National Liberation Front. The point there is that there's a surge of interest, I think, in South Vietnam. But really, you could just look at the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, which is where all the latest Vietnam study stuff is published. You'll see things like Buddhism in South Vietnam. So that's what I would say. How about, and Yen, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think there's two observations that one could make. One is that Vietnam is a case study for a lot of the global trends that are happening in terms of academia. So the trends of eco-criticism or environmental consciousness. Like you can see that in Vietnam and in Vietnamese studies, or nationalism. There was a time when nationalism was a big deal. And of course, you can see that in Vietnamese studies. So that's one observation. And then there's the other observation, which are very Vietnam-specific phenomena, including the Southern Vietnam or interest in South Vietnam, or South Vietnamese music, I think is another very specific phenomenon related to Vietnam. But I would say there's kind of a little bit of everything. And I want to summarize in a little bit some of the waves that Kevin had mentioned too, because I think that's really important. And this might touch upon what the current state of Vietnam as an academic study is today. So there are definitely waves in terms of the study of Vietnam. Had the wartime wave where the study of Vietnam was just the Vietnamese language, when officers or volunteers were commissioned to learn the Vietnamese language. And that was kind of the first step. And then I would say the effect of the war in America as a public discourse, as a thing to protest, as well as its result. The result was very unsatisfying for the American public, as this small, tiny place that was somehow able to defeat the strong Western power. That also caused that gave a lot of reason for people to look into Vietnam. Like, how is that even possible? So Vietnam, after the war, became this phenomenon, like what led to all of those events. And that made Vietnam become this very specific case of diplomatic history. Vietnam as this maybe a proxy war, or like the center for the Cold War. And then there was another wave with the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Vietnam after 1986. And that led to a boom in terms of artist creation. Writers were writing new things. Artists were producing new work. And that also led to a new wave of study in Vietnam. And then right now, linked to what Kevin was talking about, is you have generations like me and Kevin, sons and daughters of those who had fled Vietnam or led Vietnam after 1975, after 1980, who take interest in Vietnam not only as, the country that their parents are from, but that is the beginning step, but also as this place that is interesting, that is a source of knowledge, that is a place of epistemological inquiry. And so slowly you're kind of seeing the different, the different interests and waves of people who look at Vietnam through different lens. And I think finally we're arriving at an interest in Vietnam that I think is more genuine. I mean, I was like, maybe that's kind of mean to say everything else before, so it's not genuine. But I think we're getting closer and closer to the source. Does that make sense when I say that?
To me, it does. Yeah. Kevin probably has a more academic look at it, but I think so. I mean, I think one of you mentioned it. Sorry, I don't remember who in your episode about the Sympathizer, which I do want to talk about, but I think you were talking to students or something and asking who fought in the war, and the answer was, well, the North Vietnam against the U.S., and it took like some prodding to get anyone to even consider the other the other half of Vietnam that was fighting. So obviously, I know South Vietnam is sensitive here in Vietnam, but that is more comprehensive, to include that as well.
Right. I mean, absolutely. Like, just to build on what Yen was saying, like when I was teaching just a lesson about the Vietnam War in the Netherlands, there was a student from Vietnam, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, "You're the first person I've ever heard refer to the war as a civil war." And it's like, what? Of course it was a civil war. It was a war between Vietnamese. And he said, no, it was a war between the Vietnamese and traitors, and puppets. And I asked him, you think all of them are puppets, right? Do you think all of them are? And he's like, yeah. It's like, there are millions. What do you mean by puppets? Like, they just don't think for themselves? They didn't believe in what they fought for? What do you mean? And it took, you could tell that gears were turning. And so I think what Yen and I are trying to do is we're just trying to show that things are much more complicated, as historians want to do.
And maybe to qualify what I had said about going back to the source, or a study of Vietnam that's a little bit more genuine is also a study of Vietnam that valorizes those Vietnamese voices, going back to the source of the history where it actually happened by those who it happened to, as opposed to just, we are Americans studying what happened to the Vietnamese people.
Right. Yeah. Seeing the Vietnamese as thinkers, as agents, as you might call them.
Yeah, that also reminded me, I guess we can just jump into, I did say I wanted to talk about the Sympathizer a bit, which I don't want to step on the episode you both did about it, which is great. Everyone should go listen to it. But yeah, and I think it was you highlighted one scene where the captain is speaking to this white reporter, I think, like student reporter or something, and he says like, oh, we were on your side, and then the captain, who's the main character from the book, is like, well, whose side? And then the student doesn't really have an answer. So just that it's, yeah, I mean, the sides are complicated. But regarding the Sympathizer, I'll admit I haven't finished the series yet. I have read the book. I kind of thought it would be a bit bigger. I'm not like criticizing the show or anything, but it seems like it kind of came and went, which I guess is maybe a whole other commentary on the state of streaming TV. But what did you say? I mean, we're not going to spoil the show or anything, but what were your kind of takeaways without, again, stepping on your own episode that you already did?
I mean, I am with you, Mike. I didn't finish the series either. I watched enough of it to have that initial review, and we've had listeners also say, can you please give us an updated review once some more episodes were released? And I agree with you. I think in terms of the production, I think it was actually very good. The coloring, just all of the producing, the directing, I think was quite good. But, it's also a first step. So I think we have to make room for that when we're kind of judging the quality of the show, or just judging the show in general. But I think there are a lot of things that it didn't satisfy me on, in terms of, like, I mentioned this too in the episode, was the language bit, how the script was clearly written in English but translated in Vietnamese, and there are things that were kind of, that left me hanging a little bit. But I don't want to say, oh no, this is not worth watching. I think it definitely is worth watching, and it makes a lot of important commentary, or just creates space for something like this of its kind for future production that I think is quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say my Vietnamese friends here also kind of wondered what was going on with the language. I mean, they were like, people wouldn't speak like this. I mean, even if it was set a few decades ago, I had friends tell me it just totally took them out when Vietnamese was spoken. Mine's not strong enough to really notice a difference, unfortunately. But that was definitely commented upon for people who watched it here. I mean, I don't think it screened on HBO or anything, given the subject matter. But Kevin, I found it really interesting. You mentioned how, I mean, you felt some I don't know if representation is the right word, but with Viet Thanh Nguyen, as a Vietnamese American man. I also found it super interesting how you said you've never watched Apocalypse Now or kind of the classic quote unquote American movies about the war, which again, obviously I'm not Vietnamese, but my feelings towards them have changed significantly since I've lived here. Like I've seen them all, but I haven't really revisited any of them since living here. And like I remember trying to watch We Were Soldiers at some point, the Mel Gibson one that came out in, I don't know, the 2000s or something. And it got to the point where it's just the Vietnamese were just people to be machine gunned in the tree line. And I was like, I can't watch this. Like there's just like no anyway, so how have you wrestled with that? And then what did it kind of mean for you to see The Sympathizer?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I mean, first off, you're right. It is, I don't know why it's kind of difficult to get me to watch these classic films. Like I should watch them as maybe like an anthropologist or something. I should, and I think I will, but it's just kind of difficult to just see people, just treated as props.
Like I.
Oh no, go ahead. Yeah,
sorry, to cut you up, but I assigned platoon a few times in one of my classes, and every time I get to the scene where they go to the village, I just fast forward or I skip through because I cannot watch it. It's exactly what you're saying. How you can't, anyone with a conscience can't comfortably watch it.
Right, and so it's a feeling of just like disgust, but also annoyance and just. But as academics, we have to get through that, and we have to see from that perspective, which is this American perspective, trying to grapple with their own trauma. But so that's partly against that backdrop. That's what made The Sympathizer, the film or the series, kind of refreshing to see Vietnamese as their own thinkers and characters. And I know that there's going to be criticism of it. But I think Viet Thanh Nguyen and the people who made this series have done something quite good. It's a great start.
And as I mentioned, I haven't finished, but I do think that the director or the production was able to make some meta commentary that I think is worth reflecting on, like how Robert Downey Jr. played the 4 roles of the white man, or when they were in the production part of the film. It's like a film within a show. And so those things I think are worth thinking about a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I mean Downey's characters are quite, grotesque almost. There's like the Orientalist professor or whatever, for example. It's just like these guys are disgusting. So again, Sympathizer. A lot of the issues touched on there aren't readily discussed necessarily in contemporary Vietnam in many ways. And some of the episodes of your show, your podcast, touch on some potentially sensitive topics as well. So how do you kind of, I guess, Yen especially, you work in Vietnam, how do you kind of navigate those subjects?
Well, I think off the top of my head, in our episodes, we don't ever tell people what to think. And that's not the spirit of the podcast. We present maybe 1 or 2 ideas or 1 or 2 viewpoints. And the thing is, Kevin and I don't even agree on a lot of those ideas. I don't know if you've listened to our Purple Horizons episode, but I clearly had one approach to how to read that film. And then Kevin was like, oh, this is not appealing to me at all. But I also thought that in sharing those ideas, maybe Kevin had a new approach, Purple Horizon. But that's the spirit of the podcast, is to kind of create space for alternative perspectives and model that public intellectual engagement I had talked about. And I think it's so important. And now in terms of self-censorship, I think there is a little bit of that self-censorship because I love my job and I don't want to put that at risk. And there are ways that I probably self-censor that I am not conscious about, but I think this is something, I constantly think about, and we try to push against those boundaries when we bring up subjects. But ultimately, I think it's the idea is to be able to bring up topics that maybe people don't have access to or don't have spaces where they can engage with and create that space. I think that's more important, is to start that off.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting question, I think, because for me, when I'm in front of the classroom, I understand my role well. I'm paid to be a professor, to teach and to make students more knowledgeable. And therefore, I present different perspectives. And I don't think it's my role to push my personal views onto students. But then I ask myself, is that the same role when I'm doing the podcast? And I guess it is, but it's like, I should feel a little bit more free to be myself, right, Yen? Like, we're not just being professors on the podcast, but we can't help but do that, right? But I also kind of self-censor. I mean, I'm facing this kind of pressure from a different side. So the American side. So I grew up in a family that was very, very anti-communist. And in my book, one of the thinkers that I write about is Ho Chi Minh. I write about Ho Chi Minh's political thought. And when I tell my aunts and uncles, some of them fought in the war, that I wrote this book and that one of them is Ho Chi Minh, at first they were like, why are you writing about Ho Chi Minh? Don't write about Ho Chi Minh. Are you supporting him? And I try to explain, like, no, I'm not saying he's good or bad. I'm just trying to understand him, and I think they're still a bit resistant, and they probably don't want to hear too much about that.
Yeah, I mean, whether you agree with him or not, he's obviously one of the most important historical figures of the 20th century.
Exactly. Like I called him on an older website that I had. I called him, I'm writing about these thinkers, these influential thinkers. I used the word influential. And apparently one of my relatives started calling my other relatives and asking them, why does Kevin like Ho Chi Minh? I never said I didn't like Ho Chi Minh. I just called him influential, but they thought that meant I liked him.
Yeah, I find that that those generational differences among my Vietnamese American, well, I guess especially Vietnamese American friends, fascinating. I mean, a lot of them are from California, like both of you, and I know some of them, their parents routinely visit or almost retired here and love it, and then others are basically like, why? I can't believe you're in this country that I risked my life to flee, and I will never go back.
I got to say, like, I'm really grateful for my parents, especially my dad, because he's actually my dad and I actually have quite similar politics. He's like the only progressive among all of his views in California. And he supports me, he's like, look, you're an academic, you're looking for the truth from different perspectives. So say what you think is right and kind of ignore the other people who might pressure you to think a certain way.
Yeah, it's why we try to include topics from different sides or different angles. So we talk about communism, that might upset maybe a discussion on the republicanism or something like that. But I think being intellectually engaged doesn't mean you take a position necessarily, and that doesn't, even if you do, it doesn't have to cloud how you approach alternative viewpoints.
Can I also mention the philosopher who made Yen and I become friends, and that would be Michel de Montaigne. He's a 16th century French essayist who was famous for being a skeptic, for really contradicting himself all the time on purpose, showing as many different perspectives, showing that the truth changes all the time and you change all the time. You have to be open to changing all the time. So I think that's kind of the spirit that animates our podcast.
Speaking of change, I've kind of just thought of this as we're talking, and I try not to make this podcast too America-centric, but all three of us are American. So what do you think of how perspectives on Vietnam in the U.S. beyond, broadly, not just the Vietnamese community, has changed over the last, decade or so? I mean, living here, I've certainly seen it seems to shift a lot. I don't want to ascribe too much to one white guy, but I think Anthony Bourdain certainly had an impact on he's actually a big reason I decided to move here in the first place, or at least try it out. I'm not putting all this down to him, but how have you seen kind of views towards Vietnam change, from your perspectives in recent years?
Can I just, because you just mentioned Anthony Bourdain, I love Anthony Bourdain, and in fact, he has a tattoo inspired by Montaigne.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's also French, so
yeah.
Bourdain is French.
He read Sarah Bakewell's biography on Montaigne, and anyway, so Vietnam is like his favorite country, he says.
I think it was in one of his books or shows.
I think we are seeing that shift in terms of Vietnam as this historically traumatic place in terms of America's past to now being a travel destination. What we see on Netflix reflects that. You mentioned Anthony Bourdain, but also there's a tourist guide to love. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But there's a white female protagonist that is paired with a Vietnamese man that, some still ascribes to, I think, Western ideals of aesthetics or physique, but there's a little bit of a shift. And I think in terms of globally, Vietnam is also taking the place of China in terms of manufacturing. And so that'll eventually, what happens in the market will eventually be reflected back. And so now people are looking to Vietnam as the new economic boom place, like where to go if you want to build a business or start your business. So it's slowly changing. And I'm really curious in terms of intellectually what that means.
I think so. Vietnam has been seen in the eyes of many as kind of a success story, if I should use that word, like in terms of economic growth, in terms of Vietnam's ability to share the benefits of that economic growth among its population compared to its neighbors, compared to post-colonial nations. Life expectancy, infant mortality, like all these, indicators just show that Vietnam is doing quite well compared to others. And so it was interesting to see. I was just in Vietnam a few months ago, and I was at the Hoa La Prison Museum in Hanoi, which of course has this narrative of the French built this prison to imprison Vietnamese anti-colonialists, and then the Vietnamese revolutionaries use it to imprison American pilots. And then they have this exhibit outside where they have quotes from these American pilots who visited like just a few years ago. And of course, it's pushing a narrative, obviously, but the narrative is like that, they treated the American pilots well, right? Very humanely, with dignity. And then the pilots are saying, I was treated very well, and it's so great to see your country flourishing. Of course, back in America, you're going to get memoirs from pilots who will say different things. But what's the point I'm trying to say here? I do think that many Americans look to Vietnam with fascination. How did this country become so, quote unquote, successful after it had been through so much?
And yet within the country, I feel like there's a bit of an identity crisis. It's like, are we a socialist state? Are we a communist state? We're market oriented? Like, what does that mean? Where are the limits of that? So I think that's still something we're figuring out.
Yeah, that on that last point, it's been interesting seeing there was recently this issue about whether or not the U.S. would recognize Vietnam as a market economy. That the U.S. did not. It's still non-market, but there was just like some, I don't know, split screen or dichotomy. It's like you want to be a market economy, but you're a socialist country. I know that's simplifying things a little bit, but the terminology sometimes can just be a little contradictory.
Right.
And I think last question, you're both being very generous of your time, but since you both focus on history, I've always, or not always, but I'm kind of fascinated by how little focus there is on the war here, considering it took place here, whereas the U.S., it remains kind of this deep scar. For older generations, certainly. it's still discussed in politics. Like Afghanistan is, whatever military quagmire is next as the next Vietnam, just shorthand. What do you both make of that as, the war happened here, but it's kind of less of a topic of discussion almost than in the U.S.?
Can I just jump in? And I remember when I was in Vietnam, like I said, a few months ago, but a few months before that, I was there again. By the way, I lead these groups. Maybe I should advertise that too. I lead these groups of, I know, shamelessly advertising all this, but I lead groups of students to Vietnam from the U.S. So it's this organization called CIEL, the Center for International Experiential Learning. We take groups of university students from many different universities to regions in the world affected by conflict. And so we started a chapter in Vietnam. So took some students there, really amazing experience. But I remember I was in this museum in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and nobody was there looking at the war stuff except me. There were a lot of young Vietnamese there, but they were taking fashion shoots. They were modeling like by the stairs and out, none of them were looking at the stuff. Only I was. And so to me, it was so symbolic, wow, this new generation really just kind of moving on. And as the war stuff just gathers dust,
I think an analogy for the question is how many Americans are talking about the Mayflower or the colonial time when these Britain people came over and colonized the Americas. I think it has to do with the narrative that's been told. In the U.S., the narrative is we are so powerful and we came in and we killed all these people. So that's working on our guilt, and that creates a complex that a lot of Americans have and want to sometimes dwell in and talk through. I think that's the case with Oppenheimer, the movie, or all of the Vietnam documentaries. It's the same kind of tone. How do we grapple with that guilt? Or how is it that we were so powerful and then lost? So there's the other version of that. Whereas in Vietnam, people have moved on. We don't have time or energy to dwell on this history. And I think also in part with the narrative that they've been told that we were victorious, or this part of the country was victorious, and now we can kind of move on with our lives because we already did that. I think if the story was different, if there were a lot of casualties that maybe could have been avoided and there was a guilty conscience that they had to work through, then it would be different. But I think that is the distinction between how Vietnam views the war and America views the war.
But I agree. But I should also add that, I've met a few young Vietnamese people, and I asked them what they think of Ho Chi Minh, just because I'm very curious. And it's almost always been unanimously very warm. For example, I was in the Netherlands, I was at a conference, and this young Vietnamese scholar, we were talking about Ho Chi Minh, and she said, she lit up and she was like, oh, I just kind of dream of leaving Vietnam, traveling the world to learn about it in order to help my own country. Wow, there is this kind of feeling there, at least, if not about the war, then for Vietnam's heroes.
Interesting. Okay. I guess he's considered uncle for a reason. Yeah, anyway, my last closing thought, it is always interesting. It doesn't happen so much anymore, but certainly when I first moved out here and would go back to visit the U.S., older family members especially, would be like, oh, do they hate Americans? Or, what's it like living in a communist country? And, those sorts of, those questions are understandable for people in their 60s or 70s, but it is remarkable how little it kind of, not that it doesn't matter, but it's not a topic of daily conversation.
I think once the American population or that generation is no longer of this earth, and it's also become less of a conversation. Vietnam will just be reframed or rebranded as an economic boom or something.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, Ian and Kevin, I won't take up more of your time. Thank you so much for spending some time on the show. I highly recommend Nam Phong Dialogues. It's a really thought-provoking, very accessible, which I know is part of the point, podcast. I'll include the link to it in the show notes. And Kevin, I'll include a link to your book as well. Remind me of the title.
The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization.
Okay, very cool. We'll definitely check that out as well. Well, anyway, thanks to both of you for coming on the show.
And Mike, thanks so much for having us. I really enjoyed this talk and really appreciate you having us on.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.